Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish Prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.
Hi folks, welcome back to Through a Scottish Prism midweek special. Great to have you with us again. I'm delighted to say I've got a really special guest for you today, and that's Professor Glenn Diesen, excuse me, a professor in the Southeast Norway University, a political science, excuse me, and is a regular commentator on Russia Today, on Scandinavian media, and he has been, shall we say, slightly criticised by a lot of his colleagues, Western colleagues, for his views on what's going on in the Ukraine, and that's what we're going to talk to him about today, Ukraine and his views and what's happening there. Welcome. Glenn, welcome. Really, I seem to have a wee frog in my throat. It's really good. As I said, you're a professor, a political scientist and a professor. You take a keen interest in matters that are going on in Eastern Europe and Ukraine.
Yeah.
That's your expertise?
Yes, that's correct. Mainly focus on Russia. So primarily, well, initially the relationship or construction of a post-Cold War security architecture, and thereafter I've been focusing the last 7 years more on the so-called Greater Eurasian Partnership, as Russia tries to link itself closer with China, India, and countries in the East.
I on the day the Russians rolled into the Donbass, I wrote an article grabbing the title. It's been used so many times. The first casualty in war is truth. But I have to say, as someone who's been demonstrating against war since Vietnam when I was a teenager, Glenn, I have never seen such distortions as in this particular conflict. Have you?
No, and it's been quite an effective propaganda campaign, because at the heart of it, I think, is the claim that it was completely unprovoked. Mm-hmm. And it's a very clever approach, because if you try to explain why it was provoked, any explanation of Russian policy is then portrayed as being an effort to legitimize it. So if you explain that, no, it was provoked, Russia had, we knew this would happen, or any recognition at all about NATO stomping over legitimate Russian security concerns, it will then be sold as being sympathetic and thus supporting of the invasion, and then you should be censored and ideally fired and thrown out from polite society, because. And this is the problem. We can't explain anything, because that's legitimizing it. So it's it's very unique. I haven't seen this either. Of course, there's a lot of propaganda around the Iraq War, but nothing like this, I would say.
No, absolutely not. I mean, I have been demonstrating against wars my whole adult life, and since I complained about this and called for a ceasefire, you must be a pro-Putinist if you want a ceasefire. I just don't understand it.
No, it's quite impressive. They made the diplomacy and negotiations into naughty words, and also they were able to twist things around, because they essentially monopolize what it means to help Ukraine. So if you support Ukraine, that means you would have supported the toppling of their government in 2014. It meant that you support, the undermining the election the Ukrainians had in 2019, and it means that if you really support Ukraine, you really have to support them fighting aimlessly, dying in the tens of thousands in a war they can't possibly win. This is what they say supporting Ukraine mean. If you call for negotiations, find some settlement to end this horror, then you're agent of Putin and you're serving the Russians. So it's again, this is how propaganda works. You divide it into in-group, us versus them, and if you don't follow our line, then you belong to you're essentially sitting in the trenches of the adversary, and you're an enemy.
Yeah, I mean, we spoke earlier just before we started recording about Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who has been, a leading, I suppose, truth teller in this whole thing. But I think anyone with an ounce of brain, didn't have to be a soldier like Colonel McGregor to know that there is no way that anyone could have believed surely that Ukraine could ever defeat Russia. And yet they encourage them and keep encouraging them to die in their tens of thousands. It is quite criminal. Have we frozen there?
Sorry, the volume cracked up there a bit.
I was saying it's been quite criminal that they're still allowing them to die in their thousands.
Sorry, could you repeat?
Yeah, I was saying everyone and anyone with even the slightest knowledge of military matters would have known that Ukraine could never defeat the Russian army, and yet they were encouraged to do so. It's quite criminal that they're dying there in their tens of thousands.
Yes, and what is extraordinary as well is we have these leaks from the Pentagon where they have done the assessments, and they already knew in advance, as was reported in the Washington Post, that this had very little chance of succeeding at all. I mean, there were heavily fortified Russian lines, and also the Russians controlled the sky, and somehow they were supposed to just storm these defensive lines. And even in the Washington Post, they quote the Pentagon document saying that, well, they were hoping that the motivation and the passion of the Ukrainian soldiers would allow them to overcome the Russian defenses. I mean, it's very grotesque, because if it was our own men dying on the front, we wouldn't talk like this. We wouldn't send tens of thousands into certain death in which there's close to no possibility of succeeding. But again, it's what many American leaders have very openly stated. They say, listen, the objective here is to weaken Russia, their strategic adversary. So, and we're not fighting with our own men. I mean, how many politicians have said this now? Mitch McConnell saying, listen, this is primarily about weakening Russia. It's all nice and well about the Ukrainians, but that's not the main objective. You have Lindsey Graham also saying this, that we have a great format here. The Ukrainians will fight to the last man, and if we just send them weapons. And this has kind of been repeated over and over again. Retired General Keith Kellogg also said the same thing. This is a great war. We can fight the Russians. And so it's just it's a disregard for the Ukrainians. And all of this is being done in the name of helping Ukraine, which is kind of grotesque, especially if you see the videos of helpless Ukrainians being dragged out of their houses and pulled to the front line, simply to die. So it's again, my point is we would never have done this if it was our own men dying on the front. So I think this is very dark.
I mean, I read somewhere we're heading towards now. There'll be more Ukrainians dead in this special military operation than the Americans lost in the entire Second World War. It is quite grotesque that this goes on, but it's sanitized, Glenn. I mean, if you go to YouTube or you read any of the Western media, it really is discussed like a John Wayne movie. But the reality is that young men and women are being slaughtered in their tens of thousands. How long can this go on?
Well, this is what a war of attrition is. It's exhausting the adversary, and the NATO said it will continue to pump in weapons as long as there's Ukrainians able to pretty much walk. So, it depends, but I think that the Ukraine has become quite exhausted now, and you see this also in the more desperate recruitment and also morale collapsing as well. So you have more troops surrendering. So it seems to be reaching a breaking point. So it's hard for me to say when that breaking point would be, but again, it's quite grotesque, the media, because this is the way it's always displayed. You have the bad guy, which would be Russia, then you have the victim, which is Ukraine, and then you have the heroic West, which selflessly just wants to support the Ukrainians. But the problem is there's very little evidence for this. On the contrary, it's a lot of evidence to show that we helped to provoke this war, and once the war occurred, a lot of efforts were made, especially by the Americans and the British, to prevent any peace negotiations from actually happening. So it's very distorted, the media view.
Yeah, but even that, and people like Van der Leyen as well, they haven't given themselves an off-ramp. I mean, how the heck do they get off of this? Because surely there must be some sane voices, Glenn, saying, we can't win this. It's time to call it a day. We're just throwing money, bad money, good money after bad.
Well, there's more voices coming now. I think we have a lot of our hope was pinned on this counteroffensive because we armed the Ukrainians, we gave them so much weapons, and now that it failed spectacularly, there's been so many casualties among the Ukrainians, and all this equipment we sent have been lost. So it's I think more voices will come now simply because our ability to continue this war will continue to diminish. But I think there's still I think still the loudest voice in Washington still says, we can still continue to bleed the Russians. We can make this a long war, just because this is a unique position the Americans currently put themselves in. I mean, they can, again, as American leaders continue to remind us, this is a great opportunity. You can just continue to kill Russians, weaken Russia without putting any American soldiers in harm's way. So it's I think they would go for kind of the Afghanistan option, just drag this out and bleed Russia for as long as possible. Ironically, the main thing that would make the Americans reconsider would be if Russia can find a way of inflicting pain on the Americans, or if Russia begins to seize large parts of strategic territory around the Black Sea, at which point in time the Americans might have an incentive to stop.
But here's the other, on the other side of that, there's lots of coming out, you're closer to it than myself, a lot of word coming out that a lot of people in Russia, the hardliners, are concerned that President Putin's not going hard enough. He's not, he's got so many soldiers. I mean, there's something like, was it 300,000 or 400,000 in reserve that are not even in the actual fighting just now. And if they were let loose and the generals were let loose, they could finish this very quickly. Is there any truth in that?
Yeah, but that's been the truth since 2014. Keep in mind that once the fighting began in Donbass, there was a lot of push from the hawks in the Russian army saying, listen, we have to support these people in Donbass. They're gonna, they're ethnic Russians or mostly Russian speakers. They're being, de-Russified effectively after the West backed the coup in Kiev. But Putin, he kind of put his hopes on settling this diplomatically, which was done with this Minsk agreement of February 2015. But as we now learned it was negotiated by the Germans and the French, but as both the German and the French have now said, this was just to buy time so we could arm the Ukrainians. So there was no intention to actually fulfill or honor this obligation of the Minsk agreement. So this has put Putin in a weak position, and this is also part of the misinformation or disinformation in the West, which is the idea that behind Putin there's a huge part of governments and society who would simply like to return to the Yeltsin era of having more liberal policies and be more aligned with the West. The opposite is true. There is a huge resentment now, and people would like to see harder policies, and they think that Putin has been too weak. Again, for many who's been watching maybe too much BBC, this might come as a big surprise, or might not trust what I'm saying on this. But again, I was writing about this all the way back to 2015-16, that there was growing pressure on Putin, that his failure to be harder meant that he was emboldening NATO. I mean, this is how it's being seen. So it's especially now that NATO continues to escalate, sending harder weapons, stronger weapons, more long-range weapons. The argument you hear more powerful or strongly now from Russia is, well, what are we doing if the Americans are escalating in order to send weapons, which Americans provide intelligence, the missiles, and train the people who should fire these missiles deep into Russian territory? This is an American attack or a NATO attack on Russia. Like, surely we have to respond. If we don't respond, we will just embolden them to send more powerful weapons. So this is kind of the argument which is now gaining momentum, which is the risk of not striking back at NATO is greater than the risk of striking NATO, and that's a very dangerous position to be in. But again, we can't make this argument in the West, because if you say it, then, well, you're legitimizing what Putin's doing, and now you're a Putinist. So common sense is not allowed anymore.
Yeah, I mean, they've been very restrained, the Russians, in real terms. I mean, we know that in the West, when they go, it's just shocking off, flatten everything, blow it up, and then just move in. Whereas it's almost, I mean, as a Scotsman, I sort of align it to Putin's almost looks fighting the Ukrainians as Scots invading Ireland and fighting in Ireland against the Irish, or Norway fighting against Sweden. They see these people who speak the same language as them, who have the same culture. And there's also been, rumour has it, that he's loath to go and kill other Slavs in massive numbers. Is that a fair shout?
Yeah, no, of course not. So this is one of the reasons why they didn't want to use too much military power. It's also one of the reasons why a lot of the Russian population initially did not very much care for this war, because this was against the country closest to them, who were considered to be brotherly people. But I think once they were in the war, and NATO stated very clearly, or the Americans stated very clearly, that the objective was to weaken Russia as an adversary, they started to speak about regime change. Some argued that they should dismantle the Russian Federation. Then, they see this as, once we're in this fight, surely you will support your own survival. So it's so now, of course, there's a large majority which supports the war. But no, this is not a popular war, because again they thought they would be, they seemed unimaginable only 10 years ago that they would be fighting each other.
It's NATO's meant to be, it was allegedly as a peacekeeping force to protect us from attack, not to become a belligerent in a war. They've actually torn up the rule book and just gone for it. It's against everything that NATO was founded upon, is it not?
Yeah, but again, we have an ideology now which is immune to facts. I mean, we all have to keep repeating the line that NATO is a defensive military alliance, even when we're bombing countries from Yugoslavia to Libya. It doesn't mean anything, but I guess we identify as being defensive. But either way, NATO stopped being a defensive alliance in 1999 when it attacked Yugoslavia. And again, this has been the problem. One could argue that NATO was a source of stability during the Cold War, because it was a defensive alliance, it was a status quo power. But after the Cold War, NATO became a revisionist power. It began to expand, and it began to attack countries which hadn't even threatened it. So this argument that it's merely a defensive alliance, it doesn't make any sense unless you radically redefine the word defense.
Yeah, I would say, I've often said, and I say it again, that NATO is just an extension of American foreign policy.
Yeah, well, no, I would agree. It's the main organization which facilitates U.S. hegemony in Europe. And again, there shouldn't be any controversy around it. If you read the Senate hearings from 1997 in the United States, when they were discussing whether or not they should expand NATO, this was very openly. What did they say? Well, NATO is the main instrument for U.S. influence in Europe, so we can't give this up, because the security dependence of the Europeans have on the Americans allow the Americans to convert this into political influence, also economic loyalties. So this had to be sustained. And by the way, if you also go through this the debates they had in the Senate, they also very clearly said that this was intended as an insurance policy. That is, if they would ever have any future conflict with Russia in the future, well, then Russia would be surrounded by NATO states, and this would give the Americans overwhelming advantage against the Russians. Some sensible voices like James Baker came out and said, well, obviously, if we're going to expand NATO towards Russia's border in order to have an insurance policy against future conflicts, obviously this will make Russia an enemy because they will react negatively. The great George Kennan made the same argument. He was the engineer or the architect of the containment policy after the Second World War. And he gave an interview in 1998 to the New York Times in which he made the same argument that, expanding NATO to Russian borders to hedge against a future threat, the only thing it does, it ensures that Russia will become an enemy, because now it becomes impossible for Russia not to expand. And it becomes impossible for Russia not to react to NATO expansionism. And then he also made a prediction: once NATO reacts to NATO expansion, once Russia reacts to NATO expansion, the NATO expanders will say that, haha, we told you so. This is what the Russians are like. They're aggressive. Good thing we expanded NATO. So it's very dishonest. And if people would familiarize themselves with, especially the discussions that were had in the 1990s, you can't say with a straight face that this was not provoked.
No, of course, we go back. I think it was under President Clinton when Putin just became the president. He actually asked to join NATO. I mean, that would have, created peace, but they refused to let Russia in.
Yeah, no,
it's the competition.
Well, initially after the Cold War, we actually had an agreement for a common European security architecture. We had the Charter of Paris for a New Europe in 1990. And based on this, we established the OSCE in '94, which encapsulated the Helsinki Accords and effectively set the format for an inclusive security institutions in Europe. And we began to cancel this. We canceled it effectively when we began to expand NATO. And when we expanded NATO, the Russians realized, the OSCE is going to be impotent. So Yeltsin asked, maybe we can join NATO, and we gave him the cold shoulder. Then Putin came to power. He suggested the same. Again, nothing. In 2008, Russia's President Medvedev, he suggested, how about we create a pan-European security architecture? NATO can be a part of it, but just, we're end this zero-sum block politics logic, and instead, have a common Europe where everything isn't divided as, either us or them. And again, this was brushed off. Then in 2011, the Russians suggested, how about the EU-Russian economic union? So all the countries between the EU and Russia, which are deeply divided, wouldn't have to choose between East or West. And again, time and time again, we said no. And the same applies for 2013, when the EU offered this association agreement to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians and the Russians came back saying, listen, can we have a trilateral agreement? One with EU, Ukraine, and Russia, because if you force the Ukrainians to choose between East or West, you will likely have civil war. The EU said no. We will. This is not what we do. The Ukrainians have to choose, and then civil war we had.
Yeah, I mean, the ironic thing is, if the Russians had toppled the Mexican government and put soldiers and missiles in Mexico and in Canada, a lot. Would the Americans have stayed restrained for 9 years, waiting to try and negotiate? No, they wouldn't, of course. We all people as old as me remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. It doesn't happen. But the UN's been found wanting here as well, Glenn, is it not? I mean, if we take the nuclear power station and that the IAEA, the International Atomic Authority, have gone to inspect, see, they won't even turn. They say they don't know who's shelling it. The Russians occupy it, and so the implication is that it's either the Ukrainians are shelling it or the Russians are shelling themselves. The UN won't even come out and say, no, it is the Ukraine that's doing it and they need to stop, which kind of shows that the UN's also chosen a side, has it not?
Yeah, it seems so, but still, sometimes they do come out and dismiss some accusations. For example, the Ukrainians said that the Russians had put mines all across the roof of the nuclear power plant, and then the UAE goes up and says, no, that never actually happened. But it is a tendency to, we have to blame everything on Russia, because if we don't blame Russia, then you're a Putinist. So, the Russians blew up their own gas pipeline. The Russians are shelling the nuclear power plant, which they've been controlling for for a year and a half now. They never shell any of the other nuclear power plants. The other 3, which is under Ukrainian control, they only shell the one they control. And it's always this, they flew drones into the Kremlin because it's a false flag operation. They always attack themselves, and it's very interesting because I think most people realize, well, this is ridiculous, but it doesn't matter. It's you can't say the obvious, because the only thing that matters is you have to show that you're in the right trenches. Are you in our trench or are you in the Russian trenches? If you are with us, then you repeat the line, and you don't say anything that can undermine the credibility and the cause of Ukraine. So, academics, journalists, everyone just becomes information warriors, where the goal is simply that people should have a certain opinion. That's their job.
Yeah, another is the EU. We've always, since the EU's been around, one of the big selling points for the EU was that it's kept the peace in Europe for so many years, and it's always been seen as an honest broker to be able to go in and negotiate pieces globally. Now it too has shed its neutrality. I mean, they were even finding money for Ukraine from the EU Peace Fund, which I found the highest hypocrisy going. The EU has damaged itself, or allowed itself to be damaged by this conflict as well.
Yeah, and it's a great shame because, again, the European Union was based on some nice ideas after the Second World War. The French, the Germans, they would not fight each other again. And of course, it's in this spirit we had a great opportunity in the 1990s to replicate the same with Russia.
Yeah.
And also bring them into the fold to create a Europe which includes Russia. But instead, we began to cancel our agreements for a common Europe, and instead we expand NATO and the EU, which are effectively, both of them envision a Europe where at some point all countries will be part of it, except the largest country in Europe, which is Russia. And so we're not repeating the peace. The EU isn't really following the peaceful ideals that they aspired to after the Second World War. Instead, they're putting the solution after the First World War, which is the Treaty of Versailles, when they attempted to perpetuate the weakness of Germany. That's what we have done to Russia, and very openly, by the way, stated that it's better to have a weakened Russia. So it's I think it's a huge failure of the EU, and the fact that you have people like Josep Borrell, when the war started, saying this war will be decided on the battlefield. No, again, it's not very good for a diplomat to say, but this is what they're saying. Or for that sake, NATO Secretary General, pretty much paraphrasing George Orwell, saying, weapons are the path to peace. This is, of course, it's a very absurd way of speaking.
I think it was Einstein that said, repeating the same actions over and over and expecting a different outcome is the sign of insanity. Well, early on, the European Union must have noted that the sanctions they were putting on Russia were actually hurting the European Union members more than they were hurting Russia. But yet again, I read today that they're coming up with their 12th package of sanctions. Why are they not seeing that these sanctions are having no effect?
Well, the key word here is course correction. When something isn't working, you have to change the course. But the problem is we kind of got stuck in this. I think rhetorically we paint ourselves in a corner, because it was assumed that the Russian economy would collapse by the end of the week, and then a year and a half after, they're growing while Europe is declining. So it's very difficult to correct now. All the political legitimacy has been invested into the idea that Russia was going to be defeated. We're not able to defeat them on the battlefield. We're not able to destroy their economy. We're not able to isolate them in the world, as now about 85% of the world's population don't want to send weapons. They don't want to use sanctions. Instead, they say, we want to pursue peaceful options. And how do we respond? Well, the Americans even toppled the government in Pakistan because they called it aggressive neutrality, which is now, again, another Orwellian term which becomes more and more common. It's, I think the whole our peace reputation for being peaceful is all wasted in this. The sanctions, I don't see any course correction, because what are we going to say? We were wrong. We made a mistake. No, I think at some point, I think many are eager to get rid of the sanctions, but first we have to be able to declare some kind of a victory. But I don't see one on the horizon.
Yeah, because we have hardliners in Washington who are, it seems, ideologically driven. Because this, as I say, the sanctions are hurting the West more than they're hurting the Russians. And we know, that they were saying things like, well, they can only get chips out of washing machines. But of course, they forget that Russia's got a lot of friends in the world, and they have managed to source what they need.
Yeah, they've adapted quite well. The army the Russians have now is very different from the army of a year and a half ago. They mobilized a lot of men. They upgraded a lot of their weapons. The amount of missiles and tanks and the armory they're producing now is way higher. But it's not just our inability to weaken the Russian economy. It's the larger picture where many are missing, which is that the West, especially the United States, it's that they're trusting the US to essentially administer the world economy, this US-centric world economy. It's gone. It was already, declining, but now with secondary sanctions threatening both adversaries and allies alike, who's going to trust, dependency on Western technologies, Western industries, transportation corridors, banks, our currencies, payment systems? This is why you're seeing a huge backlash now. It's not just the Russians, it's China, it's our own friends, India, Turkey, it's the Arab states, Latin America, Africa. They're all now saying the same thing. We want to effectively embrace this BRICS model where we, where we decouple or de-Americanize or de-Westernize. So pursue alternative technological centers, industries, transportation corridors, banks and currencies. So this is going to have a huge consequence. In my opinion, this is this is not just the death of Western hegemony, but we can really be severely weakened from this. And there's nothing being done to restore trust. And I think it's also blindness, because we fed ourselves this propaganda so heavily now for so long, not just the past year and a half, but for the past few years of Russiagate, that the Russians are pure evil, that we forget that outside of NATO, you have the rest of the world, the vast majority of the world, which doesn't see the conflict like this. They don't see this as being a struggle between good and evil. They don't support Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but they don't support this NATO proxy war against Russia either. So it's, I think we have deluded ourselves very much.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that the West and the EU and NATO, US, it's always the stick, never the carrot, always the stick, beating up, threatening sanctions or carrying out sanctions, bombing, attacking, whereas the Russians and the Chinese have been using soft power very much to their advantage. Again, you would wonder, why doesn't someone in the West think, why don't we try and change direction? Why don't we try and be the nice guys for once? It just seems that they've only got one gear, and that is stick, stick, stick.
Yeah, and I think it's the curse of success, if you will, because after the Cold War, all the power was concentrated in the West, and when you're all powerful, you can afford to make many mistakes because you can absorb all the costs. But after a while, the costs begin to accrue, and also the rest of the world begins to grow tired of you. So I think that's what you're seeing now. We have overextended ourselves, and the ideology is maintained. We still want to be able to dictate, but the rest of the world isn't following anymore. And I think this was very evident from the G20 meeting, because we all go down there as trying to tell the Indians and everyone else, listen, this is how it's going to have to be done. You're going to have to criticize Russia on this, you're going to do this, and then suddenly realizing that no, we don't have to listen to you anymore. And it's a hard pill to swallow, because we had now centuries of Western hegemony, and as Macron pointed out, it's come to an end, and it's very hard to adjust to this new world when suddenly a British Prime Minister realizes that, oh, the Indians won't do as they're told. It's a different world.
Yep. I mean, it's like the school bully has just had a punch in the nose by some new guy that's arrived in the playground. But this proxy war, and anyone who denies it's an American proxy war is living on another planet. Now, I don't care if they call me a pro-Putinist for that, but it's just a fact. But it's had the opposite effect, Glenn, of what they wanted. Instead of weakening Russia, they've actually weakened themselves, and they've weakened the entire Western hegemony with their stupidity. And they keep compounding it by making the same mistake and keep on going as if doubling down, it's going to change an inevitable outcome.
Yeah, and I don't see it. I don't see any prospect for it to improve itself either, because as we see, this is a war of attrition. We see that every month by month, the Ukrainian casualties gets worse. The Russian casualties are reduced. NATO's depleted its weapon storages. Russia is now, has higher production than it's ever had. It's importing from friends and allies, and no, it's just all the indicators are showing that we are losing this, and I think it's but it's very difficult to have course correction when you painted yourself in this corner, because we said that we're fighting against the new Hitler, and the Russians are pure evil. And I'm reminded of Walter Lippmann, who over a century ago wrote a lot of the fundamental literature on propaganda, and he had this very good argument, which was that the great thing about propaganda is when you present the world as being a conflict between good and evil, when one side is completely innocent, the other one is just embodiment of evil. The benefit of it is good to mobilize the public, because everyone, nobody wants to compromise or negotiate with evil. They want to fight. However, when it's time to make peace, he argued, then it's a huge problem, because now you're not allowed to negotiate with evil. You convince the public that this is a moral necessity to fight on, and then this was kind of his main lesson from propaganda, why he went from being a proponent to being opposed to it. So I think this is it's a very nice description of where we are now, because how are we going to make peace with the Russians? We told everyone that they were, that Putin is Hitler and all this nonsense. So there's very little ways to turn around and make peace now.
Yeah, I think, well, I'll come on to that in a minute, because I think there's only one off ramp for the Americans, and that's probably their election next year. But this counter-offensive that we've heard about, that was going to get them into Crimea and take back Crimea, and we're still getting told that the breakthrough's coming, it has been an unmitigated disaster. They haven't even got to the first line of the defensive positions. And the rains are coming. What's going to run out first, the counter-offensive or manpower for the Ukrainians?
I think both the weapons and the manpower is being drained too quickly. So this isn't sustainable in any way. And also, even if they would have a significant breakthrough, keep in mind that the Russians they have hundreds of thousands of soldiers mobilized and armed in the back. So they can, if the situation becomes critical, they have efforts to reverse it. But it's important. People keep looking at the map, saying, they're making advancement, even if it's small ones. But see how much they lost. They lost, tens of thousands of soldiers and all this equipment to, take territory which barely shows on the map. I mean, it's very small areas they've been able to take in this counteroffensive. And so how do you measure success? If it's part of the territory, of course, it's not a lot of success. But in a war of attrition, where the goal is to exhaust the enemy, they have depleted themselves. So this is so it doesn't really matter what they take if the Russians are able to simply push them back thereafter. So I think I don't think the strategy makes any sense anymore. I think it's just we don't know what else to do, so we keep banging our head against the wall.
Yeah, so I read somewhere, I think that the Russians now occupy 86,000 square kilometers of Ukraine, but Ukraine are winning the war according to the Western media. Quite bizarre. But here's the other one that's going about, Glenn. They're saying, well, we might have to put boots, and there's a conflict coming, and the Americans might have to put boots on the ground. I'm not a military man. I don't for a minute profess to be. However, if they've had to send cluster ammunition because they don't have enough shells, to supply the Ukrainians. What kind of ammunition are they going to use if they do decide to go and fight Russia with NATO?
Yeah, this is problematic because we already sent so much of our own weapons. So, but it's, I think a lot of it would be assumed that it would kind of be a force of deterrence, being able, because it's the belief that the Russians wouldn't dare to kill NATO soldiers, so this they would allow them to set up a safe zone effectively. But I would say it's exactly the opposite. We've been so openly and eagerly killing Russians, not just in Ukraine, but also in the Russian Federation now. So that, like I said, they're really looking for a way to bring pain to the Americans as well, in order to essentially adjust their cost-benefit analysis for continuing this war. So if NATO's boots begin to pop up in Ukraine, they will be the first to be targeted. So it's I mean, none of this makes any sense anymore. And, I'm sometimes reminded when you were in school learning, how could people stumble into the First World War? Wasn't it obvious what could happen? I mean, we think we become wiser, but how are they not seeing the path we're on? This is going to end in horrible disaster. And also this whole idea of fighting this war of attrition is also a very bad idea, because it will end in a victor and a loser. But you don't really want that outcome either. First of all, if the Ukrainians lose now, they can lose their entire nation. The whole nation can collapse. If Russia would lose, they see this NATO in Ukraine, and especially in Crimea, as being an existential threat. I'm certain that we would have nuclear war long before NATO gets to march through Crimea. So do we really want to see a winner? Like, I would rather say we need to find a solution, because both the Ukrainians, obviously, but also the Russians have legitimate security concerns. We have to address both sides, and instead of continuing this idea that we're just going to bleed everyone white. It's insane.
Yeah, I mean, Odessa was founded by Catherine the Great. And so the Russians view that as a Russian city. Now, if the Russians go as far as Odessa, and maybe into Transnistria as well, Ukraine becomes landlocked. I don't see a good outcome anywhere for Ukraine, because then perhaps the Latvians or the Lithuanians, rather than the Poles, might decide they want to take back Western Ukraine for themselves. This is to me, the only innocents in all of this are the ordinary Ukrainians. They're the ones that are going to lose most out of this, not the Americans, not the Russians. It's the ordinary Ukrainian citizen. There's no win for them in this, is there?
No, definitely not. And that's why I find it so appalling when we hear all this talk that we're helping them, because if Ukraine begins to collapse, I wouldn't be surprised, especially if Poland takes a chunk of Ukraine itself. So there is, but again, if you go back to when Russia invaded, the day after, just to point out the absurdity of it, the day after, the Ukrainians said, well, listen, we'll talk to the Russians without any preconditions. That was on the 25th of February. On the same day, the American spokesperson, Ted Price, comes out and he says, listen, we're not going to talk to the Russians. We're not going to negotiate without preconditions. First, they have to withdraw completely, effectively capitulate. Then we'll negotiate. And, a month later, the Americans made it clear, because at that time, the Ukrainians began to talk to the Russians and negotiate. And the Americans said, again, very clearly, this is, we're not going to support these negotiations, because this war is bigger than Ukraine. This isn't simply about Ukraine. This is, what we call the rules-based international order, which is liberal hegemony, we call it, unipolarity. So, Ukraine is an instrument. We can fight the Russians with it. So the idea that they're able to market this and sell it as helping Ukraine, I find it to be very absurd.
Yeah. When we've had major wars, particularly European wars, they've always brought massive change after the First World War. We had universal suffrage that came, that wasn't there prior to the war. Second World War, we know about, for example, in the UK, where they brought in a decent welfare system, and a lot of countries changed their constitutions, etc. The world is not going to be the same after this. It's already a different place. But what do you see as the major changes that will come from this war?
Well, I think well, what's going to happen on the Russian side is from now on they're going to have a much more powerful military. They're going to, because they watched now all the countries of the West openly going against them, talking about regime change, dismantling or breaking apart Russia. So they will have a heavy military looking west. Meanwhile, all their economic connectivity will begin to go to the east, which they've been already preparing for. That means the technological partnership, the trade corridors, the currencies they use, the banks, the insurances, everything will now begin to be less dependent on the West. So I think this is what you're going to see. We'll see more new economic architecture emerging, which is which is decoupled from the West, and effectively, post-Western world. Not led by Russia, of course, but economically, China is the heavy hitter, and this is the big problem with the whole thing, because historically, the British were able to dominate Europe ever since the Napoleon's continental system by keeping the major countries divided. The most important ones to keep divided were the Germans and the Russians. And that's been, they've been successful at this now, of course, decoupling them completely, especially after Nord Stream, blowing that one up. But what we've done instead is pushed Russia towards a much larger Germany, the Germany of Asia, which is China. Now you have the Chinese economy with the Russian coming together. And not only this, an exclusive little bloc, but there is a huge gravitational pull. They're pulling in, you see the Arab states now aligning themselves closer and closer, Africa, Latin America. Who's standing with the West these days? You only have NATO countries and Japan and Australia, of course, more or less, but it's, I think we're isolating ourselves, and I don't see any positive outcome, even if Russia will be severely weakened. The rest of the world will move on, and I think that's that was kind of the lessons from the 19th century as well, which was while the British and the Russians were competing across the Eurasian continent, new centers of powers emerged. So the Germans, Americans, Japanese, and I think that's what you're going to see now as well.
And when this is over, I mean, Russia's found new markets for their gas and oil. In fact, they've increased it. So when this eventually comes to an end, as it will, I mean, an end, although you don't know how or when, but it will come to an end. And the West say, well, okay, we'll take your gas and oil again. There's a good chance the Russians are going to say, nah, you're all right. We've got other markets. We don't need your market anymore. Make your own arrangements. This is really the stupidity of what the West has done. And in tradition, as you say, Germany and Russia were the biggest trading partners with each other. That's destroyed completely.
Yeah, that was the problem. I mean, Russia was good for us in this way. They gave us cheap energy, cheap, reliable energy. We complained about it, but nonetheless, and this fueled our industries, made them more competitive. And then all this produced goods we exported to Russia because they favored exporting energy to us, and they favored economic projects with the West. But all of this was premised on the idea that Russia wanted to create what Gorbachev referred to as a common European home, or as later on Putin then called simply Greater Europe. However, once it became evident after 2014 that we were intent on creating a Europe without Russia, Russia began to look more towards the east. And this is going to be a huge consequence, because now the cheap energy will go to Asia, and and then the Russian market, it will be supplied by Asian countries. So they don't want to have Western pharmaceuticals, machine tools, any of this anymore. They want to get it from the East instead, because we weaponized everything of the economy. Access to technologies, products, the currency, banks, everything is being weaponized. Yeah. Why would you, if you predict that this conflict will continue for decades to come, of course you would make yourself vulnerable. And you're very correct. We can't find any good substitutes for Russian energy. We can buy American gas 5-6 times the price, but the Russians have new markets for their energy. So when this war is over and we want to get the Russia back again, just start selling us cheap energy, we're gonna have some very unfortunate surprises.
Yep, that's why they're trying to take it out of Africa from Nigeria, for example. But what we have here now is a clash, I believe, of financial capitalism, e.g. the West, on Australasia, against industrial capitalism, which is the Russians and the Chinese, etc. They still make things, and their economy is safer. I mean, you can only with the financial you can sanction and take away and steal money. They can't take away the industries that produce or the gold or the minerals or the natural resources. It's a fight we should never have got into.
No, it was, well, we told ourselves Russia was just a gas station, masquerading as a country, we kept saying. But
with an economy as small as Italy's, they told us. Now it's the largest economy in Europe.
We neglect that they are an agricultural superpower. They're an energy superpower. And unlike the Europeans, who all our digital platforms are American, our Google, our Amazons, our social media, the Russians, they have a domestic digital ecosystem. All their major tech companies are Russian. Many of them cooperate with Russia, and us are with China, but they're still majority holders are still the Russians. So they don't. Google is not the biggest one. Their Amazon's not the biggest one. Facebook or Twitter is not the biggest one. They have all their own systems. So this idea that this was already, we still live in the 1990s, believing that Russia's this backward country only looking to the West. But again, you're very right. I think over time especially since the late 80s, early 90s, we began to financialize our economy. We created this international division of labor where we would have the top tier, so the innovations, the financial industry, and they kind of grew, and then we exported the rest. Well, what we then saw was China gradually climbing up global value chains, and now they're technologically outcompeting the United States. So where's our place in this international division of labor? Well, we don't have a place anymore because the Chinese can do anything that the Americans can't. So everything that the Americans can. So the Eastern countries now are able to effectively live without the West if we want to sanction them. And if we sanction China, the Russians, they're able to still get by. But we're realizing that, all these financial instruments are all nice and well, but we're still going to have food crisis. We're still going to have energy crisis. We're still going to have this disrupted supply chain. So we're going to suffer greatly after this. And I don't see this ending in any good way at all. I think this idea that we can find a victory and come out on top, I think it's ridiculous. At this point, we should cut our losses, have some decency, do what's right on Ukraine, try to find the best possible deal, and then start to try to restore some of the severed ties and rebuild trust, because this has been the worst foreign policy mistake in decades.
For sure. As every day goes on, there's less for Ukraine and Kiev to negotiate over. They're losing everything more every day. But just to ask, do you see any kind of off-ramp for the West to get out of this, or for Russia to get out of this? Is there any escape route in the short term?
No, I think the only way to fix this crisis is we have to go back at the heart of the problem, which was neutrality for Ukraine. This was a good deal. Keep in mind that between 1991 and 2014, the vast majority of Ukrainians did not want to be a part of NATO. NATO even has a paper published in 2011 after Yanukovych took the presidency, where they complained, only 20% of Ukrainians want to be a part of NATO, and they have neutrality now in their constitution. What are we going to do? This is terrible. So this is but it worked. Ukraine shouldn't have to choose. It should be a neutral country. That worked for everyone. And of course, it shouldn't be part of a greater Russia either. What Ukraine should do is diversify its economic partnerships so it doesn't become too dependent on either the West or Russia. It should, it should have freedom like Mexico. Mexico can trade with anyone who wants. No one decides over Mexico. However, obviously, China and Russia can't establish military bases in Mexico. That's not the freedom they have, because they will be bombed by the Americans. So it's not going to happen. But it's the same with Ukraine. They have to find a way of preserving its sovereignty, and but this can't depend on having threatening Russian security, and essentially NATO being an existential threat. So it's the only way we can do this is go back to neutrality. It's the only way. And of course, it's much more problematic now, because our refusal to accept Ukrainian neutrality has now created a conflict which involves territorial disputes, and Russia's not gonna. The deal which was on the table in March of 2022 is now gone. They're not going to give up the territory which they now claim are Russian.
There's someone far smarter than myself once said that you cannot look forward without looking back. And if anyone had bothered to check history, the Russians will sacrifice anything for the motherland. They will not be defeated. They just won't be. I mean, the thought that anyone thought that Ukraine could go in, march in and conquer Russia, it was insanity. If I'd said this to you, I don't know, 5-10 years ago, that would be the narrative, that Ukraine can go and defeat Russia and conquer it, you'd have sent me to the nutcase house.
Yeah, and it can't happen, and that's the thing. But even if Russia would, even if NATO, because NATO, they're fighting all of NATO now. NATO is pouring all these weapons in. They eventually disarmed NATO. So the problem here is, even if we would be able to exhaust the Russian army, there's millions and millions of men who would want to, come forward to protect the survival of their nation. But not only that, if they run out of weapons, do you really think that China, they want to stay out of this? They would like to see a negotiated end to it. But if they see that Russia would be failing and actually losing, of course, they would never permit this, because they know very well that if Russia would be defeated by the Americans, they would be next. So, of course, they're going to be supporting the Russians then. I suspect they already are, that some of the chips and the drones are, come from China, probably through Iran, but nonetheless, it's these days, it's not you manufacture a drone and ship it across. You can always, these components, people help to assemble it. There's material obviously coming from China. I would be very surprised if China's not helping Russia in some ways in this struggle.
For sure. I mean, as I said earlier in our chat, the first thing that goes in war is truth. Hypocrisy. I mean, the Americans, who are supplying billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of weaponry, then complain that they think that maybe another country, you can't send weapons to Russia. That's wrong. It's just wrong. You're escalating the conflict. And you say, what? You just sent 110 billion worth of weapons, but you're worried that someone's sending a few chips or sending a couple of. It's if one's wrong, both are wrong.
Yeah, no, definitely, and I think this is the fact that we've been fueling this war for so long now with weapons, and then look towards the rest of the world saying, don't you dare send anything to Russia, and also it's immoral not to join sanctions. I mean, it shows the mentality, though, how convinced they become that this is a conflict between good and evil, that when we send weapon, we're virtuous. When they do it, it's evil. And again, this is the problem of having this good versus evil narrative, or Prism, because whenever we do something, if we invade a country, it's maybe it's the wrong thing to do, but we did it for the right reasons. We wanted freedom or whatever. But when the Russians do something, they might do the right thing, but they do it for the wrong reason. So if they invade a country, they would do the exact same as us. It's it's an evil action. So the whole purpose of propaganda is that you shouldn't be able to compare our actions with the Russians. So it's a very foolish endeavor.
Yeah, I mean, the funny, the ludicrous thing about all this is that Ukraine was geographically so well placed, if they hadn't chosen this route, to be the conduit for the EU and for the West into Russia, and for Russia to use Ukraine as a conduit. And Ukraine could have become so wealthy being the middleman always makes the money. And they could have had a really booming economy by being a foot in each camp, and instead they've gone for self-destruction. It is quite sad, Glenn.
Yeah, well, that's part of the things Yanukovych was aiming for back in 2013, because the Europeans wanted a partnership to pull Ukraine away from Russia and towards the Western orbit. Russia really wanted to prevent this, and then they thought, okay, we can get the best deal from both sides now. But again, that was not good enough, which is why when the Ukrainians decided to go with the Russian loan in 2013, we began to instigate riots in Ukraine, very openly supporting them. I mean, people don't want to call it a coup, but it's very strange. I mean, it couldn't have been more open. You know, you had the recordings of people like Nuland and Piatu revealed that, you know, before Yanukovych was toppled, they already talked about, okay, once we got rid of him, who's going to be in the new government? And the Americans are choosing, handpicking who should be in and who should be out. And so, yeah, this is kind of the forcing Ukraine to go with one or the other. It's going to be in a very weakened position because our main interest in Ukraine is simply to weaken Russia. I never heard any stories about our great aspiration for having close relations with Ukraine. I think I think that's a problem. It's not love for Ukraine. I think it's hatred of Russia, which has motivated a lot of this.
Russia-phobia, absolutely. They still look upon the Soviet Union. Look, we've run out of time. I could sit here and talk to you probably all day and half the night. I want to thank you very, very much for getting your valuable time and expertise and coming here to talk to us. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. And I wish you good luck in the next referendum.
Yeah, well, we're working on it. And to you, my viewers, I hope you enjoyed Professor Glenn here, who has told you the facts and the reality of what's going on, the truth. And that's all we ever want. But until I see you again in the very near future, please, for you and yours, please take care.
Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.